to issue these tariffs. They say that that is not actually in the language of that statute, that this power was not authorized by Congress through how it was written. President Trump argued otherwise, that he has broad authority as president if he believes there is a national emergency to use IEEPA to issue these tariffs in the interest of foreign policy and the national interest. So the Supreme Court, however, has decided against him. We have just learned.
Okay, keep digging into that decision, please. Let's go back to Natalie Brand. And Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the issues that even some conservative justices were talking about during oral arguments was handing over this incredible executive power and what that would mean for future presidents, that no reasonable commander-in-chief would likely give that power back, the power to use IEEPA to do its bidding. Remind us of sort of the push and pull and the separation of powers at stake here.
Well, and just big picture to this specific administration, this has been a central part of the president's economic agenda, imposing these tariffs to try to bring investment back to the United States, and also use the threat of tariffs to cut all of these various deals with trading partners around the world. So the impact of this to this administration cannot be overstated here. And the president knows that. He's kind of called this decision in the past when, waiting for it, really life or death. And just the logistical questions now raised about potentially having to give some of the money resulting from tariffs back, how that would even work. This was also top of mind for the president yesterday when he went to Rome, Georgia, to give a speech and rally, talk about his economic agenda, talked about tariffs, said that he was waiting for this decision. And really, again, he's touting all the good that it has brought the United States. But yes, he announced them under this emergency power, which obviously a lot of lawmakers, businesses were pushing back against and saying you do not have the authority to use that to cut these various deals with countries and impose tariffs on individual trading partners. This is separate from the other types of tariffs on sectors, specifically when you're talking about, steel or aluminum or other items. Those it's a separate bucket. So we'll have to wait and see how this ruling potentially extends to other aspects of his tariff policy.
All right, Natalie Brand reporting from the White House. In just a few moments, we're going to go to a CBS News special report.
Good to be with you. This is a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel in New York, and we are interrupting our normal programming because the Supreme Court has just issued what is a major ruling on the president's use of tariffs. We have a team going through this decision right now from a legal and economic and a political point of view. But first, our legal correspondent, Jan Crawford, who has the decision for us in Washington. Jan?
Tony, this decision is 6-3, invalidating President Trump's use of these sweeping tariffs, imposing tariffs on almost every trading partner worldwide. This is the most significant U.S. Supreme loss for a U.S. president, I think, in modern history. It is invalidating what is the cornerstone of President Trump's economic policy, ruling that he does not have authority under this federal law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to levy these sweeping tariffs, like I said, on almost every global trading partner worldwide. Now, there are other issues involved. There are many different decisions from all of the justices. This is a deeply divided issue. They're not agreeing with all of the reasons why. But the bottom line, it is at 6-3 with two of President Trump's appointees, Justice Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Neil Gorsuch, joining the Chief Justice John Roberts and the three liberal justices to invalidate the use of these sweeping tariffs. There are three dissenters, led by another appointee, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, joined by Justice Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. But the bottom line, Tony, a major defeat for the president. I think you can put that right up there with some of the most significant Supreme Court losses by a U.S. president in history.
All right, Jan, thank you very much. Let's go to CBS News legal analyst Jessica Levinson, who's also reading this decision with us this morning. We knew this was going to be a nuanced legal case, and indeed it was. What were the big questions and how were they decided?
So the big question, exactly as Jan said, is whether or not the president has the power to impose these sweeping tariffs under this particular law. It looks like a lengthy, divided, and complicated opinion, but the bottom line is exactly what Jan said, which is the president does not have the power under this particular statute. Why? Because of the text of the statute and because of the power that the Constitution gives to the president versus Congress. It looks like, based on our quick reading, that this is all about the idea that the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce, that the Constitution gives Congress the power to impose taxes, and that when we look at this particular statute, that it does not look like a delegation of Congress's authority. Like, we have the power under the Constitution. Are we now going to ship that over to you, the president? And today the court says no. Obviously, it's a case with huge implications in terms of the economy, in terms of the power of any president. But based on our reading right now, it looks like this is all about looking at specific words like regulate and determining what that means for the power of any president, again, under this particular statute.
And yet so much money has already been outlaid, in particular by Americans, to deal with these tariffs. So I want to give our legal team a little bit more time to go through this decision and look at the potential remedies, what's been decided here. But in the meantime, I want to bring in our senior White House and political correspondent, Ed O'Keefe, because, Ed, as Jan outlined, this is obviously a major defeat for the White House on one of its key economic policy agendas. What now?
And not only the economic agenda, but arguably the foreign policy agenda as well, Tony, because the hope here at the White House at times was to be able to use the threat of tariffs as a sort of a coercive tool to get their way with certain countries or certain parts of the world, most especially Europe in recent weeks. We have no reaction yet from the president, who is at this hour still meeting, we believe, behind closed doors here at the White House with a collection of the nation's governors who happen to be here in town this weekend for their annual meetings in Washington. The president has said, though, in recent weeks that were this to happen and the Supreme Court does not uphold his tariffs, quote, we're screwed. It would take many years to figure out what number we're talking about and even who, when, and where to pay back. The Trump administration's collected at least $130 billion in tariff revenue, according to U.S. Customs and Border Protection reports out in recent days. And there will be businesses across this country now wondering, do I get my money back, and do I get it back with interest? More than 100 different companies of all sizes had filed suit, raising questions about the legality of these tariffs. And the question now will be, does he perhaps try to seek tariffs or put them in place in other ways? There are ways, in fact, he could do that. We've seen him, for example, put tariffs on various sectors of the economy, like the semiconductor and manufacturing equipment that goes with them, medium and heavy-duty trucks and parts, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals. Does he perhaps pursue ways to go into those specific sectors, depending on what part of the world they happen to be produced in, if not here in the United States? The other thing he could try to do is use essentially national security rationale to put in place some tariffs as well. But again, no definitive response yet from this White House, which had to know for the last several weeks, if not several months since this was argued, that this was a possibility. And we should also point out, the court now, in essence, is aligning itself with public opinion, which has found this to be an incredibly unpopular move to put these tariffs in place, and it contributes to America's concerns about the American voters' concerns about the state of the economy. 63% of Americans oppose these tariffs on goods and services and believe more broadly that the administration has focused too much on imposing tariffs and not enough on driving down prices in other ways. So we will await reaction here. But as Jan said, an incredibly strong rebuke here by the Supreme Court, by two of his appointees joining with the court's liberals to say, no, the president overstepped here, and it's Congress that's supposed to be imposing tariffs as part of U.S. economic policy.
And Ed, and you're right to point out that it is not an exaggeration to say the whole world was waiting on this decision, because much of the world has been entangled in these tariffs. And you mentioned the powers of Congress. We have a quote here from the majority opinion. Chief Justice Roberts saying the framers gave Congress alone the power to impose tariffs during peacetime. I want to bring in our Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, who's also reacting to all this for us. Major Garrett, the Supreme Court in other matters has gone in the president's direction, but not on this one. What does that mean?
Well, the Supreme Court is well aware of the constitutional history of generating revenue, a power explicitly reserved to Congress in its origination in the Constitution. And before we had an income tax in this country, we raised revenue principally through tariffs. And there were lots of conflicts that previous Supreme Courts dealt with about the legality of those tariffs. That precedent is a backdrop for this. President Trump has jawboned and criticized this court, saying if you rule against me, you're going to destroy our economy, waging a very aggressive public relations campaign. But the court cares what the Constitution says and what precedent says. It's interesting to note, Tony, this 1977 law that Jan and others have referred to grew out of a crisis with Iran after the Iranian Revolution. And it has been used principally to freeze assets or to levy sanctions. The Trump administration told the Supreme Court it had almost unlimited powers to impose tariffs, not just as an economic matter, but as a diplomatic cudgel. And what the court said, and I think this is important, summarizing the administration's argument before it, that view would represent a transformational expansion of the president's authority over tariff policy. It is also telling, the court wrote, that in the IEEPA's half-century, that's the law of existence, no president has invoked the statute to impose any tariffs, let alone tariffs of this magnitude and scope. So essentially what the court is saying is, we have a Congress. Congresses negotiate laws with presidents as this law was negotiated. If you follow that law, you can do it. If you expand way beyond that law, you can't. And to Ed's previous point, there's another law, 1962 law, the Trade Expansion Act. There's a Section 232 there. This president, previous presidents have used that to impose tariffs. There are many remedies that this administration could look to. And the trade representative, Jamieson Greer, has said many times, if we lose in the Supreme Court, we have other remedies to advance our tariff agenda. This is not the end of the tariff conversation under this administration, but it is a setback significantly on this variant of using tariffs the way the president has attempted to enforce them.
Major, thank you very much. Let's talk about the economic impact now with our CBS News senior business and technology correspondent, Jolene Kent. Joe, Major touched on the magnitude of these tariffs. Ed did as well, $130 billion, give or take, 90% of which American consumers have borne the burden of, according to the New York Reserve. What happens now?
Yeah, that comes from the New York Federal Reserve. But I want to tell you, my phones are exploding right now with reaction from small business owners across the country. We've been interviewing people about these tariffs for over the last year. And Emily Lay, a small business owner in Sarasota, Florida, tells me she's thrilled, she's relieved. It gives us clarity. She runs a very successful stationery and planner business. Another business owner, Beth Beneke in Zumbrata, Minnesota, southern Minnesota, she runs Busy Baby Map. And she says she's seeing major relief, that this is bittersweet. She just signed another $13,000 check to, for these tariffs to China last week. And now she feels like maybe she can start seeking a refund. Now, when you pull back, how much has the average American household paid for these tariffs? You can see it's about $1,700, according to the Yale Budget Lab. So what happens next if this continues to move apace? We expect overall prices, which could be good news for consumers, to drop, but that won't happen quickly. We also expect to see perishable items, your fruits and veggies, they actually might go down in price a little bit more quickly. You might see durable goods like your tech products and furniture see a slight decrease as well. And you can see overall the price increases that you may be facing at home due to tariffs across the board there, especially in apparel, things that are imported from overseas. But if you're looking for a Trump tariff refund, if you will, as an individual family member, for example, that's probably off the table. But we do expect businesses to start seeking tariffs and perhaps forming class action lawsuits to get this money back as a result of this ruling. Those companies could get refunds from the Treasury, but overall, the small business reaction has been overwhelmingly positive, saying they feel that they're thrilled and they're relieved.
All right, Jolene, thank you very much. I want to go back to our chief legal correspondent, Jan Crawford. After that short breather, she dug into the report a little bit more. Jan, it's not a straightforward ruling. A lot of American businesses are wondering what now? What changed in the last 15 minutes about American economic life?
Well, that's to be determined because, as Jolene said, Trump has other areas. Those are much more limited, though. They can't be this sweeping. But I think what's really interesting, Tony, is 6 of the justices, 3 conservatives and 3 liberals, came together. They didn't agree on the bottom line, but they didn't agree on the reasons, but they agreed on the bottom line. And what this says is that all of these people who've been saying that this is a Supreme Court that's in the tank for Donald Trump need to take a look at the facts. Yes, this is a court that recently has been giving the Trump administration some temporary wins, not letting lower court judges block all of his policies while the litigation unfolded. But as we have discussed, Tony, when the court is considering the merits of these cases involving President Trump, he is not going to win them all. And this will not be the first case he loses in the court this term.
And so, Jan, if we see additional tariff levers used by the president, is there a chance we could end up right back at a crossroads like the one we're at right now?
I'm sure there'll be litigation, but those, I think, are on much more solid legal ground, Tony.
All right, Jan, thank you very much. Again, a major decision from the U.S. Supreme Court just moments ago, a 6-3 decision. Most of President Trump's tariffs were invalidated. Our coverage of this major decision and its impact will continue on CBS News 24/7, on your local news, and tonight, of course, with me on the CBS Evening News. Many of you will now return to CBS Mornings. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm Tony DeCopel.
All right, you've been watching a CBS News special report. The Supreme Court of the United States has just ruled that President Trump's sweeping emergency tariffs are illegal. It was a 6-3 decision. The judges determined that the president does not have the power under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose those tariffs. I want to bring in CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman, who is also a lawyer. We also have on deck CBS News contributor Jessica Levinson to talk about this. But first to you, Katrina, let's talk about this. The Supreme Court ruling that, in fact, the president does not have the legal authority under what he was calling a national emergency, under national security threats, to impose tariffs on countries unilaterally. Break down this decision for us and explain to us what's sort of unique about this, which is that you have 3 conservative justices that joined 3 liberal justices to come down with this ruling.
Vlad, that's right. This is such a significant decision, as Jan Crawford was just talking about. The fact that these 3 liberal and 3 conservative justices came together and struck down something that is at the heart of President Trump's agenda, his tariffs. Now, one thing that stood out to me, I'm still reading through all of this, that is not really in this opinion, Vlad, and that people have been waiting for, is a discussion of refunds. What will happen with all of this money that has already been collected through the tariffs that President Trump imposed? And the only mention that I could even find of it was in a dissent from Justice Kavanaugh, where he brings up the fact that during the Supreme Court arguments, they acknowledged that these refunds would be a mess and that the court actually doesn't address it here. But a core part of this opinion, which was written by Chief Justice Roberts, is that he says that the power to tax is one that is a power of Congress, and that the president can't read into these words, regulate and importation, that are in IEEPA, the statute that he used to impose these tariffs, and assert that power to impose tariffs. He says no president has ever done this before, and especially not in this broad, sweeping way that President Trump has. And he actually wrote regarding those words that the president tried to use from the statute, he said those words cannot bear such weight.
Let's go ahead and show the breakdown of the justices and where everybody came on this. We have Justices Kagan, Sotomayor, Jackson, Gorsuch, Barrett, and Roberts here with the concurring opinion, striking down his ability to make these tariffs. And then we have Justices Thomas, Kavanaugh, and Alito, who dissented. And I want also to show 2 phrases that we've been able to pull out. So this is the breakdown here. And then also, Matt, if we can pull up FS Opinion 2. And what strikes me here is where it says IEEPA's key phrase, the one the government relies on, says nothing about imposing tariffs or taxes. And then if we can bring up full screen Opinion 6, it says the government thus concedes the president enjoys no inherent authority to impose tariffs during peacetime. Have you been able to read the dissent yet, Katrina?
I have not been able to read the dissent yet, or there are multiple dissents. There's many opinions in this very over 100-page tariff opinion, and it shows the weight of this decision, the significance of this decision, Lindsay. But you're right; those are key aspects. The way that the president tried to read this particular law, and what the justices decided here is that the president has to point to clear congressional authorization. And they just say that that does not exist here. And having listened to the Supreme Court arguments, I'm also not surprised by this breakdown, even though it is unique for those justices to come together, because even those conservative justices were expressing a lot of concern, one about whether there is any distinction between the power to tax and the power to tariff, but also about what this means for presidential authority, for the separation of powers in the United States. If the president can essentially take a power that has been delegated to Congress and read it into a statute where they say that language just is not there.
All right, Katrina, stand by. I want to bring in CBS News contributor Jessica Levinson to talk more about the decision here, Jessica. So, Jessica, you may have seen a couple of days ago, we had Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson on CBS Mornings. And I'm not a lawyer, but all I did was I looked at the Constitution and I said, you know, Madam Justice, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Of course, as you know, duties and imposts being that 18th century term, that means U.S. customs charges and tariffs. And now you've got the Supreme Court of the United States ruling, in fact, that the Constitution does not allow the president the power to impose these tariffs. What was so difficult about understanding that from the government's perspective, that the president does not have the ability to do that, since it's so clearly laid out in that article of the Constitution of the United States?
So I think you're exactly right to point us back to the fact that the Constitution gives the federal government only the powers that it gives it, by which I mean that the federal government is a government that functions based on enumerated powers. You can't do anything unless the Constitution tells you that you can. It's not like states. States have general powers, something called sovereign powers or police powers. So what happens in this case, the majority of the court looks at the Constitution, they look at the statute, and they say to not just this president, but any president, no, you can't. You cannot use this statute to impose taxes. And if I could briefly summarize what you've already been talking about, it's that, Vlad, as you just said, the Constitution says Congress gets to impose taxes. Congress gets to regulate foreign commerce. Congress gets to regulate domestic commerce, interstate commerce. Now, when could that change? And this was a big part of the case. It could change if Congress says, I know I have the power, but now I'm handing it to you, Mr. President. I'm giving you enough clarity and enough direction such that I can cede, I can delegate some of my power. That's part of what the government was arguing here. And I think, Vlad, to your question, part of why for the government and for the dissenting justices, it wasn't that clear cut. But what a majority said is Congress didn't delegate this power to the president. Congress didn't use clear terms to say the president gets to impose these sweeping tariffs by using the IEPA. And so what the court did was really spend a lot of time looking at the Constitution, looking at the statute, looking at the specific terms of the statute and saying, it's not this statute. This statute doesn't allow any president to do what this president is claiming it can give him the power to do.
So, Jessica, then let me ask you about the dissent. The dissent says that they believe that Congress intentionally gave the president of the United States broad emergency economic authority. They are also arguing that the court should defer to the executive branch during times of national emergencies, although it was never very clear that we were in a period of national emergency, given that the president would often just impose a tariff on a country that seemed to disagree with him, and he would often do that on social media. And that they also
put out a marketing video
or put out a marketing video.
Exactly
right.
Canada.
When Canada put out that video, the president, well, now I'm going to slap tariffs on you. I don't know that that is the definition of a national emergency. And Jessica, finally, the minority, the dissenters, claim that the majority is unnecessarily, and this might be an interesting point to discuss, unnecessarily restricting the president's flexibility when it comes to foreign affairs. Break that down for me.
Great questions. And this really does evidence the split that we saw in the oral arguments, where you did have the government saying that, number one, the president gets broad latitude when it comes to emergencies. Now, you brought up the question of whether or not there is an emergency. This is a separate question of, if the president says there's an emergency, who gets to second guess that? Is it unelected members of the judicial branch that get to second guess? Can Congress try and claw back this power and say, no, it's not an emergency? So that's kind of question number one. The president says there's an emergency. The government is saying that gives any president much more power. And then I think bucket number two of what you were reading to us from the dissent is the idea that when it comes to foreign affairs, not just in times of emergency, but even in general times, that we do give the chief executive, again, any president, broad authority to conduct foreign affairs, in part because the president it's not a deliberative branch. The president can move more quickly. And now, basically combining those two things, it's foreign affairs and it's an emergency, the Trump administration said, so we have the power. And I think that was compelling for the dissent here. The idea that if we limit the power here, that we're unnecessarily limiting the power, again, not just of this president, but any president. I think what the majority is saying is, even if you want the president to have greater flexibility and an authority when it comes to emergencies, when it comes to foreign affairs, this isn't the statute that's going to get you there.
For anybody who's just joining us, we are right now covering the breaking news that the Supreme Court says that the president cannot use the Emergency Powers Act to levy tariffs against other countries. We are talking with Jessica Levinson. And before we get into the political implications of which there are many, I want to read another quote, Jessica. This is Full Screen Opinion 8. It is also telling that in IEEPA's half century of existence, IEEPA being the Emergency Powers Act, no president has invoked this statute to impose any tariffs, let alone tariffs of this magnitude and scope. What is the significance, Jess, that Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority opinion?
So it's significant in the sense that I think we tend to think that these big decisions where you and I will get on the air live and talk about them will always be conservative versus liberal. And what we see today is that's not always how it goes. This is a question of what power does the Constitution give Congress? What power does the Constitution give the president? And what happened in this particular statute? And I think what we're seeing today is what we saw in oral arguments, where Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Barrett were looking at this particular statute to link to the quote that you just put up there. They were looking at this statute and they were saying, so nobody has ever tried to impose a tariff under the statute, and then let alone a tariff this broad. And you had Justice Barrett saying to the government, can you point me to any situation where this particular language was used to impose tariffs? And I think, Lindsay, again, to your question, what this shows is the idea that what the justices are doing is looking at words and interpreting their legal meaning. And that doesn't always fall cleanly along ideological lines. We have the Chief Justice, I think from the get-go of the oral arguments, looking at this statute and thinking, this is a big question, and Congress has to do something. He's looking at the non-delegation doctrine. Congress has to be really clear that it's giving the president the authority, that it's delegating its own authority. And I don't think I don't think the Chief Justice thought Congress was giving the president that power. It's really all about the interpretation of the text.
So, Jessica, stand by. I want to bring in senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, who is joining us now to break this down. And Ed, one of the questions that I have for you as I get your reaction to this ruling is what you believe the president's reaction will be. We've seen him, and you will be able to provide unique insight to this because you are constantly, every day, tracking the president, his movements, and his words. Leading up to this decision, the president, even as early as I think it was either this morning or yesterday when he was on Air Force One, and in conversations that he had, just offside conversations in front of cameras to reporters, suggesting that it's a disgrace that this has made its way to the Supreme Court. In other words, he believes that he has the authority to impose these tariffs. What do you think the president I shouldn't ask you what you think, but what has he said leading up to this decision about how, if this goes against him, how he will feel?
Yeah, he said last month that if the Supreme Court does not uphold his tariffs, quote, we're screwed, adding it would take many years to figure out what number we're talking about and even who, when, and where to pay. In essence, do we have to give back all this money? There's been at least $130 billion in tariff revenue collected since this began last spring. More than 100 companies suing in one way or another to try to force this decision and get refunds for that money. And so this is the very definition of a bad day for any president, to have a signature hallmark underlying policy of virtually everything else he's doing tossed out by the Supreme Court on constitutional grounds. And I'm so glad Jessica Levinson made the point she made, which is that this rises above partisan politics and is about constitutional interpretation of the text. And 6 of the 9 justices said he cannot do this based on a read of the Constitution. We are living, the Trump era is the greatest living, breathing constitutional exercise this country's ever gone through, with the constant question of, can he do that? There's also the should he do that, but there's the can he do that? And we got a very clear answer from the Supreme Court today on the underlying question of who gets to impose tariffs. The answer is Congress. We'll read the texts, Jessica, Jan, Katrina, and others, and then the viewers will be able to interpret them as they want to. But bottom line, a president cannot do what he was trying to do with these specific tariff authorities. That does not mean, however, that the administration isn't going to try in other more limited ways. The trade envoy, Jamieson Greer, has said in recent weeks that they would try to seek other kinds of tariffs. So what other kinds could they potentially impose? There's something called the Trade Expansion Act that allows you to potentially put them in place based on national security reasons. So you've seen what they call sectoral tariffs on certain sectors of the economy or industries like aluminum, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, truck parts, medical components. You can do it that way. You can also do it because of concern with discriminatory action taken by specific countries towards the United States. That's why you've seen certain tariffs put on China, for example, or on maritime and logistics shipbuilding sectors that Chinese are involved in. That won't generate nearly as much revenue. That won't help pay for what the Trump administration's been trying to do. But it does suggest that they will keep trying, which may lead to further court cases. The president is in a closed-door meeting right now with Democratic and Republican governors. We don't have a full official guest list, but at least some of the states that sued in this Supreme Court case have their governor in the room with the president right now. He allowed reporters in right at the beginning of it, then immediately kicked them out. And the look on his face, based on years of covering him, suggested he was already in a bad mood. You can only imagine it's going to get worse throughout the rest of today. Vlad.
All right, Ed O'Keefe, stand by. Ed, I hope you're able to stand by. But yeah, let's go ahead and bring in some of our contributors, starting with Major Garrett.
Major Garrett, Chief Washington Correspondent. So, Major, let's put that to you. If the president and his trade representative, Jamieson Greer, says that they will try to use other avenues, are we just going to be back here under different premises?
Well, no, because the other avenues are existing law with defined methodologies. Ed referred to, and I did also during our special report coverage, the 1962 Trade Expansion Act. It has something called Section 232. This president has used it before. Other presidents have. It is a well-established means by which to use tariffs to achieve certain economic and national security priorities. That's available. The administration has always known this. And if I would try to put this in common language, with this approach to tariffs in the second Trump term, the administration basically said, well, we're going to seek forgiveness because we're not going to ask permission. We're going to reinterpret this law. We're going to use it far more broadly than any other previous president had, and we'll see what, if anything, sticks. Well, the Supreme Court has answered back. Not very much sticks. But that doesn't mean that this administration hasn't used this interpretation of its tariff power to significant effect already. The president would argue he has diffused a couple of very significant diplomatic conflicts, specifically India and Pakistan, with the mere threat of tariffs. It's a power he really believes he can exercise to the betterment of the United States. He will not be able to exercise it in similar ways. The other thing the court examined was what latitude or what role would Congress have in checking this sweeping assertion of tariff authority under this particular IEEPA law? Well, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Johnson, tried to keep off the floor efforts to bring any resolution to the floor to criticize or revoke some of these selective tariffs. Ultimately, he lost that battle, and some of them passed. And if they were to pass this Senate, what would happen? They would get to the president's desk. Then he would veto them. And as the court came to the conclusion, there's no majority to override a veto. So the president's powers here, if left unchecked by this opinion, would be virtually uncheckable for this president and every future president. What the court said was that's not what Congress intended. That was certainly not the intention of the U.S. Constitution when it came to revenues and tariffs. So let's put some checks into this equation to rebalance the powers between Congress and the executive branch.
Very interesting. Like we've been telling everyone, Major, stick around if you're able to. Let's bring in Market Watch reporter Joy Wiltermuth. So let's talk about reaction from markets, reaction from small businesses.
Markets have been waiting for this decision for months, months, and the anticipation was that, it would go against President Trump. You can look at the betting markets, Wall Street, everybody was waiting for, based on oral arguments, that it could go against him. So businesses, as we've already talked about, have already sort of jumped the gun and filed a suit to reclaim refunds. So that's one thing. A lot of the retailers, the big retailers that we know, if they get those back, it's going to be a messy process. President Trump has said this will be a whole huge mess if this goes against me. So the process of how that happens and when it happens.
Retailers like?
Costco sort of, was early sort of leading this, and other major retailers that have obviously trade and shipping from China, goods from China has been a major part of their business for a very long time. So the mechanism of how there are refunds will be important. It could be a stimulus. Everybody's been talking about the one big beautiful bill. Expect the stimulus of that to sort of help and support the market. So a rebate would be another form of stimulus for the market. The big thing to watch also will be the bond market, because the bond market, while nobody on Wall Street really loved the tariffs, the bond market did like that revenue. There were projections of tariff revenue under the tariffs in place would be somewhere over, $300 billion this year potentially. If that's in flux, in question now, which it is, which tariffs will be reapplied and how, we don't know where that revenue is going to be. That revenue has helped keep an anchor on long-term rates. So that goes back to mortgage rates, lending for the real economy. So there'll be a lot more wait and see mode to see how that happens and see what tariffs are reapplied in different ways and how long. But the other big issue here is, and that Wall Street's been talking about, is the affordability push. We're heading into the midterm elections. Affordability has been a big facet of what the Trump administration has been talking about. Well, one way to very easily relieve some of that pressure is to maybe slow roll tariffs back on. Maybe don't go full on and try to go through all the channels and ram it through. Because if your agenda is really to make things more affordable, well, tariffs don't help.
All right, Joy, stand by. Let's bring in Congressional correspondent Nicole Killian, who's joining us now. So, Nicole, what's really interesting about this is we've seen a Republican-controlled Congress that has been in lockstep with the President of the United States in almost every capacity. Exactly. And so the question becomes, as the court has stated, if the Congress wanted to delegate its responsibility as defined by that clause that we pointed out earlier in the Constitution, they absolutely could. They clearly have not. The question, of course, for you then is how are members of Congress reacting? Will we see members of Congress lamenting the fact that the President of the United States does not have the authority to usurp their powers?
Yeah, well, right now we're seeing quite a bit of reaction, particularly among congressional Democrats who have railed against these tariffs for some time now. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is just out with this statement that we obtained, calling it a win for the wallets of every American consumer. Also going on to say that we have said from day one, a president cannot ignore Congress and unilaterally slap tariffs on Americans. That overreach failed. However, we have also heard, for instance, from other Senate Democrats folks like Elizabeth Warren, who, while hailing this decision, also said that just this ruling alone can't undo the damage that these tariffs have already had, especially on small businesses. So she did raise that point, that it's really important to make some of these impacted businesses right that have kind of been in limbo in light of the president's tariff policies. And I would also point out, of course, we just saw recently before Congress went on recess, and I think Major touched on this just a hair, we did see Congress try to reassert its authority with respect to tariffs in a vote in the House that was successful. It was a vote that was forced by Congressman Greg Meeks, but this was to basically a resolution of disapproval against the president's tariffs against Canada, which ultimately was successful, received bipartisan support, and there was some question on whether or not that would move forward in the Senate. But obviously, there have been these attempts, though, previously, where the House in particular has tried to squash those efforts. So the fact that it was able to clear the House just a week or two ago was significant. So Congress has tried to win and where it could to try to reassert its authority. But, to Major's earlier point, the Speaker and GOP leaders have tried to kind of squash some of those efforts, obviously, based on the president wanting to push forth and move forward with these policies. So we are still kind of waiting to see if there's some reaction more among GOP congressional leaders, but certainly on the part of many congressional Democrats, they are celebrating this ruling as a win.
All right, Nicole, stand by. Let me go to Jan Levinson and talk a little bit about what this means going forward for how we understand presidential authority, executive power. So it seems as if, Jessica, the court is really drawing a line here, because what I was reminded of as I was listening to you and to others talking about this is in years past, for much of the modern era, it seems as if the courts have been maybe deferential when it comes to the president in areas touching, for example, foreign affairs, national security, and trade. I remember there was a couple of big cases, for example, with, again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm drawing from memory here, that Rumsfeld-Hamdi case where the Supreme Court held that the United States can detain enemy combatants in wartime. There was that big case in the 70s and early 80s with Iran and assets with regards to Iran, where the courts did allow the president to, what some believe, exceed his authority as president of the United States. But here, what it seems to be saying is that the deference has its limits, that essentially when it comes to the economic impact, when it comes to trade, Congress, unless they choose, and this is the question I had for Nicole, unless they choose to delegate that authority to the United States, unless they choose to try and create another amendment to the Constitution of the United States, this is a binding ruling that will, I guess, going forward, really temper a president's powers in the years long after Donald Trump is no longer in office?
Okay, I love this question because it because it reminds us of what we're really looking at here. So I think there's the sense of the Supreme Court keeps handing the president wins. And your question really focuses us on when and in what cases. And so by which I mean, if we think about the president's control over the executive branch itself, I think this is a Supreme Court that is very comfortable saying the president gets to basically hire and fire members of the executive branch. The president gets to organize executive agencies as he sees fit. And then there's another bucket or column number 2, which deals with those cases, Vlad, that you talked about, foreign affairs. And they're historically, not just this Supreme Court and this president, but many courts dealing with very different presidents have said presidents get broad authority when it comes to conducting foreign affairs. But now we have a question when it comes to tariffs that doesn't quite fall within either one of those buckets or pillars. And that's about the president's power over these economic decisions. Yes, they have implications when it comes to foreign affairs, but this is fundamentally a different question for any chief executive. This is a question of, do you essentially get to take some of the power that Congress has? And you can only do that if Congress gives it to you. Now, I think maybe we've been dancing around this a little bit, so let's lay it out clearly. One is there's something called the major questions doctrine that the Supreme Court has created. And that says when it comes to a question that has big economic and political impacts, let's think about student loans, let's think today about tariffs, that Congress has to give very, very clear turn-by-turn directions before a president takes that authority, that you can't go further than Congress tells you can. Second, and this is the last thing I'll say, there's something called the non-delegation doctrine, which means Congress can't cede too much of its power. I think you have both of those doctrines, again, judicially created doctrines at play in this case. This is not a question of the president's power over the executive branch. It's not directly a question of the president's power to conduct foreign affairs. It's a question of the president's power to do something the Constitution gives to Congress, and that's lay and collect taxes, regulate commerce. And the court today is saying that Congress didn't give those turn-by-turn directions. They didn't delegate that authority. And this is about, I think, reaffirming the idea that we are going to respect the separation of powers. We are not going to cede this authority to any chief executive.
All right, Jessica Levinson, thank you as always. Let's go back to senior White House correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, I want to ask you about the Peter Navarro of it all. He was, by and large, the architect of this, long a proponent of really aggressive tariffs. Just a few days ago, he was quoted as saying Americans are going to get this rebate. He was saying the economy is thriving because of tariffs, not in spite of them. What do you expect his reaction will be? Will he still have the ear of the president after this blow?
Whether he has the ear of the president remains to be seen. But look, this is an administration from Navarro to the president to Jamieson Greer, the U.S. Trade Representative, who's been working on all these revised trade agreements in the wake of the tariff, the decision to impose tariffs, that has said, if this day comes as it has, the way it has, they're not backing off. They will find other ways to impose tariffs. It may not generate as much revenue, but there is a belief that the president can use his authority to impose them. And he can in more specific, targeted ways. But as the justices wrote, either in their majority opinion or in concurring opinions, he can't do it quite the way he was doing it with this specific 1970s-era law that had never been used before by a president to impose sweeping tariffs like this. So don't expect them to back off because that's not the president's instinct. But there are going to be Republicans running this year that would probably like to see him back off because the polling on this has shown that it's just a terribly unpopular piece of policy for the president to be enacting. What is it? More than 6 in 10 Americans oppose these tariffs. And more broadly, about more than 6 in 10 or about 6 in 10 believe he's been spending too much time imposing tariffs instead of focusing on trying to drive down costs. And the president was arguing that tariffs would help do that. Others have said, no, you're essentially taxing American consumers as they buy imported goods. Why would that why would that help drive down costs? And they're going to have a bigger headache now as they try to either continue imposing tariffs or continue fighting this in courts. And that is that so many of the companies, the firms that sued in these cases, want and expect a full refund from the United States government for having paid the tariffs. The issue, though, and Jessica, Katrina, and Jan could get into this with a little more detail and understanding, but as I understand it, based on conversations with lawyers here in Washington who work with companies on tariff and trade matters, they got to now go back to lower courts, which had said that there would be refunds eventually, account for this ruling, anticipate appeals from the administration or other entities potentially, and then figure out if and when and how those refunds would go back. So it could still be several months, if not years, before companies get their full refunds based on today's decision, which is just another political headache because you're now going to have businesses across the country saying, the president did something illegal, the Supreme Court says he shouldn't do it, I want my money back, and why is it taking so long for that to happen? So all sorts of potential legal and political pitfalls here. We still have no reaction officially from the president. Like I told you earlier, he was in a meeting this morning, previously scheduled, with Democratic and Republican governors. At least some of the states that sued had their governor, coincidentally, in that meeting today. Whether the president knows that or not, we'll see. Whether any of those governors emerge from that meeting and speak here at the White House, we'll wait to see as well. But a pretty bad day at this White House because the underlying policy, the one the president had championed so much and insisted on imposing as quickly as possible, has been struck down by the Supreme Court. And what will irk him even more is that two of his appointees, Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, were part of making that happen.
Oh, boy. I'll be refreshing Truth Social, as I know you will. Actually, just kidding, Ed. I don't have Truth Social. But stand by. I'm going to go to, Ed, to your point that you were talking about those avenues that exist, that continue to exist for the president. I'm going to ask Jessica Levinson to prepare to talk about that, specifically the Trade Expansion Act of 62 and the Fair Trade Act of 74. But I want to go first to Katrina Kaufman, who's been looking at the dissent. And I was looking, I'm not a lawyer. I keep saying that. I'm not a lawyer. But I'm looking at some of the dissent here, Katrina, and it says here, as a matter of original understanding, I'm reading now, historical practice and judicial precedent, the power to impose duties on imports is not within the core legislative power, meaning of Congress. Congress can therefore delegate the exercise of this power to the President of the United States. Is that really in question here? It doesn't seem that it is. It's just that because this went before the court because the government was being sued.
I mean, Justice Kavanaugh seems to have a very different interpretation here, Vlad, than the majority. And something that he really focuses on when I was reading through the dissent is this issue of the major questions doctrine, which you were just talking about with Jessica, this idea when it comes to executive action with major political or economic consequences, there's supposed to be this clear authorization from Congress. Now, what Kavanaugh says is that he doesn't actually think that that applies here. And it's core to Chief Justice Roberts' majority opinion, Vlad. He also points out, and you were talking before about the foreign affairs context, he says that the court has never applied this doctrine in the foreign affairs context before. Generally, the court has given the president broad authority when it comes to foreign affairs. And he also says, as you were just saying, we're going to be discussing, that he thinks the president will still likely be able to keep most of these tariffs in place through other means. But in the meantime, there will be this mess of figuring out refunds, who will be refunded, how that process will work, which the court really did not get into in this opinion. And I think that's a surprise to some people who were hoping that there would be guidance here.
Okay, Katrina Kaufman, thank you so much. Joy, let's go back to you. What is your reaction to how the market's reacting?
Well, it does look like it's still a little bit hesitant here. We're higher, right? But not like a huge leap higher. This was expected. I guess you're always wondering, like, what is priced in? Definitely, we're expecting this, the when of it. But it's still all those questions we've been talking about. When do the refunds, what's the mechanism look like? What's the next move from the White House? We don't have those answers, so it's not a terrible surprise to see that markets aren't leaping one way or the other.
Still some uncertainty.
All right, Jessica, let me ask you again, because it's been raised a number of times, and I don't think we've talked about it, but Ed pointed out, and Major Garrett also pointed out during the special report that there are other avenues that the president can pursue these tariffs, specifically under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 and the Trade Act of 1974, which gives the U.S. Secretary of Commerce the ability to threaten to impose some of these tariffs if it's a threat to national security, or in the case of the 74 Act, if the government, the United States, is found to see that a foreign country is engaging in something that is discriminatory or even in our national, as a threat to our national security interest, the president can use those statutes to impose these tariffs. Why wouldn't they have done that in the first place and saved everybody the agita?
So you did the work for me where you laid out those particular statutes and indicated that they're narrower. So I don't think that they would have given the president the power to impose these particular tariffs because they are so sweeping. The two statutes that you just laid out are great examples of what the statute issue here, i.e. EPA, is not. They're more narrowed. They have more requirements, and they really only work in times where, for instance, there's been a finding that there's a national security issue and that we need to much more specifically respond to that. What the president tried to do is use a statute, not the two you mentioned, of course, but to use a different statute that's never been used to impose tariffs, to impose much broader tariffs. So why go through all of this? I would say, again, having not been able to read the entire opinion,
because I don't think that that would have gone far enough, that the president wanted to do something bigger and bolder. And he was looking at this statute and he was hoping it would give him the power, but it doesn't. So he's now going to have to look at those other statutes and probably do something smaller than what he wanted.
Joy, quickly, you were talking about what this could mean for those businesses who are suing the government, and Ed pointed out that it could take many, many years. My guess is that if you're a small business owner, it's going to be problematic because you need those assets. But if you're a large corporation, not something to worry about, which is, again, why I'm just trying to get a sense of the markets. It's baked into the reaction, but what if this drags on?
Well, if it drags on, maybe that's a good thing. So if it is more of a considered by committee kind of getting more people involved in what is the right kind of tariff under the right statute, if that takes more time, that's probably a good thing for Wall Street. I would say we're just going to have to hear what comes out of the White House.
Yeah. All right, folks, if you've been just following along with us, the breaking news this morning, the Supreme Court has ruled 6-3 against President Trump's tariffs, ruling those tariffs to be illegal. I want to thank our team of contributors, including Joy, Jessica Levinson, Katrina Kaufman, Ed O'Keefe, Nicole Killian, Major Garrett, Jan Crawford. We're going to hear a lot more, of course, from Major Garrett tonight at 5 p.m. On the Takeout. But that does it for us. As always, my friend, great to be with you. It's so nice that you're able to jump in and fill in with us. We appreciate it so much. Day. Incredibly busy. Great to have a pro at my side. All right, stay right where you are, folks. Mugo Odiwe is live from San Francisco right now with our top stories. Mugo.
All right, thanks so much, guys. So let's stay on that breaking news from the Supreme Court. The High Court has dealt a major blow to President Donald Trump. It ruled he does not have the authority to impose the sweeping tariffs that have been at the center of his economic policy. CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford joins us now to talk more about this. Jan, thank you for your time. I want to ask about the significance of this ruling.
Well, I mean, Mugo, I think that you can put this up there with some of the most significant defeats in the Supreme Court for a U.S. president in history. I mean, right up there with when President Truman was unable to seize the steel mills, or when President Nixon said he had to turn over those notes and couldn't assert executive privilege. I mean, I think this goes right up there because the court is invalidating what was a cornerstone of the president's economic policy. Yes, Trump has other ways, the president has other ways that he can kind of try to levy tariffs. There are other statutes, but those are much more limited in terms of how.
All right, looks like we just lost Jan Crawford there. We'll try to get back to her as soon as we can. But right now, let's go live to the White House and CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, I know the president is holding a closed-door meeting right now at this point with the governors, but any reaction so far from the White House about this? All right, Ed, can you hear me?
Well, now I can't hear Jan, or I can't hear Mugo. I am here.
Okay, looks like we don't have Ed either at this point. Do we have our correspondent, Julian Kent? Ed, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Mugo. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Perfect. Let's stick with that. We can't see you, but we can hear you. But this is
okay.
This is a major breaking news today, so we want to focus on the White House. I know you're out there. The president is holding a closed-door meeting with the governors, but any reaction from the White House on this major defeat?
So the previously scheduled meeting with members of the National Governors Association, a handful of Democratic and Republican governors, has broken up. We know that during the meeting is when this ruling came down, and called it a, quote, disgrace, and told the governors that he has a backup plan, which is what we've anticipated and what other administration officials had said would likely happen, that they would seek to continue imposing tariffs in other ways. And so you might wonder to yourself, well, how will they do that if not through these sweeping tariffs across the entire globe? There's essentially two other ways that the president can continue to impose tariffs unless or until they're also legally challenged. One is through what's called the Trade Expansion Act that authorizes the use of tariffs to address imports that the administration can consider a threat to national security in some way, perhaps because the United States needs to be making more of that product or that good or service than it currently does. That's why you've seen, for example, various tariffs put on things like aluminum and steel from other countries, some agricultural products that come from Latin America, semiconductor and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, medium and heavy-duty truck parts, arguing that those kinds of things should be made in the United States, or at least there should be a plentiful supply of them, so let's restrict the purchase of them from overseas by raising the tariffs and therefore raising the price. Now, in recent weeks, and even just in recent days, the president said he was going to roll back those aluminum and steel tariffs because it's become too expensive to build things in this country while U.S. manufacturing of those goods ramps up in the coming years. So already there's practical implications to these tariffs in addition to now the legal issue and the political concern that American voters have about them. The other way he can do it is he can put tariffs on countries because he's concerned that they are discriminating against the United States economically in some way by unfairly messing with the price of something. So that's why you've seen certain tariffs put on, for example, semiconductor products coming out of China. That's all to come in the future. The big urgent concern for so many consumers this morning, and one that the administration isn't going to be able to answer quickly, is do I get my money back for paying all those tariffs? Hundreds of firms, big and small, from toy stores in your neighborhood to large multinational corporations, have sued in recent weeks and recent months, suggesting that this is unfair to them and they want their money back. And lower courts had signaled that they would be refunded at some point. But now they're going to have to go back through the courts and talking to the Commerce Department and the Customs and Border Protection that deals with tariffs to determine how exactly to get everybody's money back and whether they're going to get interest as well. So this is going to drag out now potentially for several more months, if not years, right through an election season.
That's
where we've got at least 6 in 10 Americans saying they oppose tariffs and they think the president has spent too much time implementing them at the expense of focusing on other ways to lower prices at a time when Americans believe the economy is not in great shape, despite what data might suggest.
Yeah, and important to note that, as you mentioned, they're right through an election season, all of this happening at the same time. Ed O'Keefe at the White House for us today. Thank you so much for your time. And now I want to go back to CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford. Jan, I'm so sorry we lost you earlier there as you were talking to us, but I want to go back to just how significant today's ruling is.
Well, I mean, that's live television, right?
Exactly.
It's going to happen, and the Supreme Court's not going anywhere. This decision is not going to change. But I mean, this is, like I was saying, I mean, this is one of the most significant Supreme Court losses by a U.S. president, I think, in modern history. This is a Supreme Court that is invalidating a cornerstone of President Trump's economic policy. They're ruling 6-3 with 2 of President Trump's nominees joining the conservative Chief Justice and the 3 liberals ruling 6-3 to say that this federal law that he was pointing to, that he said gave him the power to kind of, impose these tariffs, that they're saying, no, that law doesn't say that. The law gives the president a lot of powers. It can regulate, imports. It can block imports. It can void imports. But it doesn't say in this laundry list of things that a president could do that it can also tariff imports. And so the 6 justices who invalidated these tariffs now are saying, with different reasons, the liberals and the conservatives have different reasons to get there, but the bottom line is these are done. And to Ed's point, you're talking 150, potentially $175 billion that the administration has collected with these tariffs. And so now it's going to go back to the Court of International Trade. That's how it's set up. You have thousands of businesses, as Ed said, from toy stores to Costco, who have sued wanting their refunds. And that's how that's all going to have to get sorted out. That's going to take some time. The administration, the Treasury Secretary said they do have the money to cover that. And there are other ways to levy these tariffs. So the bottom line is it may not change much for consumers at all, but it changes a lot in the terms of what the president can do with tariffs. And also, I think it's important to point out, it changes, I think, the narrative that we've heard from a lot of people critical of this Supreme Court, that they're in the tank for Trump, that they're always ruling for Trump. This is a Supreme Court, like I said, with 3 conservatives coming together, 2 Trump appointees, to strike down what is one of his most significant policy initiatives. And this will not be his first loss, his last loss. I mean, it's his first one, but it won't be his last loss in the Supreme Court this term. There's going to be others on the horizon.
And Jan, I don't have your experience or your insight into this, but is there anything to glean from the fact that the majority opinion came from the Chief Justice?
You know, he writes, I think he sees that as his role as chief to kind of take on some of these big institutional rulings, especially when they involve the president. Obviously, we saw him writing, for example, the immunity decision that said that presidents could not be prosecuted for their official acts while they were in office. So I was not surprised that he wrote that decision, and I thought from the arguments that Trump was going to lose this one. The dissenting justices are interesting. You've got a conservative Trump appointee, Justice Brett Kavanaugh, kind of leading the dissenters, the three conservative dissenters, saying that, look, if the law says presidents can block all imports, then of course they can tariff them because, you know, that's so much shorter than a sheer block. But the majority was not persuaded. They believe that this laundry list of things the law authorized just didn't include the power to impose tariffs. But again, we'll see what happens for consumers because there are those other tariffs out there and there's other ways that the president can levy some of these tariffs going forward.
And Jan, just based on that, knowing that there are other ways for the president to levy tariffs, any chance this same situation gets back to the Supreme Court?
I think those other avenues, he's on much more solid legal ground. And he's also not being quite as ambitious, right? I mean, they're more limited. The laws themselves, by definition, they're more limited. And they require eventually congressional approval. Unlike this law that Trump, for the first time in history, a U.S. president tried to use for tariffs, that Trump asserted, it gave him essentially unlimited, unbounded authority to make the tariffs as high as he wanted and to keep them in place as long as he thought was necessary. The other laws are nowhere near that sweeping. So just, I think you're not going to see the same kind of impact and potentially the same kind of legal fight that gets to where we are today with this historic ruling from the Supreme Court. And I really hate it when people overuse those words like historic and breaking, but this one, landmark is another one, but this one truly is. I think you've got to put it right up there with some of the most significant losses a U.S. president has suffered in the Supreme Court's modern history.
Okay, Jan Crawford, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks.
And now let's bring in CBS News correspondent Jolene Kent. Jolene, good to see you today. There's a big question of what impact this ruling will have on the economy.
Yeah, well, the average American household was losing their about $1,700 in real income due to these tariffs. So as we look at the major economic impact, this was an economic blow to the president's agenda without question. And we're hearing from small businesses all around the country who have really suffered from these tariffs, who have felt that they've had to raise their prices on their consumers over the last year to absorb some of that incoming cost. And just reading some of these texts here that we're getting incoming from small businesses. Beth Beneke, the CEO of Busy Baby Map in Zimbrata, Minnesota, down in southern Minnesota, she tells me this is a major relief. This is bittersweet. Now her job, she says, is to figure out how small businesses like hers can get refunded, as Jan Crawford was talking about just now. Emily Lay, CEO of Simplified, it's a really popular stationery and planner business. She's down in Sarasota, Florida. She told me this morning she's thrilled, in all caps, that she's relieved. And you know, she's been going for about 20 years. She says she's never had a challenge like this before. In a separate lawsuit, she sued the Trump administration on similar grounds to what we saw today out of the Supreme Court. And she is now also going to be seeking refunds and trying to regroup and figure this out. And for so many small businesses, this has really been about whether or not they can grow, whether or not they have to lay off workers, and also, of course, prices. So when it comes to prices that you're paying, for example, at the grocery store, we do expect to see prices drop more immediately on like fresh fruits and veggies, but other things like apparel and other types of imports, those decreases may take a little bit more time to go.
And Jolene, we know that the Supreme Court didn't really mention much about just the avenue into which people can get refunds, but I'm sure that's what those business owners are looking for, right?
Yeah, that is what they're looking for. And of course, all of this takes time. And just as tariffs took a long time to actually, have a major economic impact, we're now seeing the reverse of that. We're just in stage one, just, an hour or two into this. But what the small businesses are telling me is that they feel like they have some clarity here. And what's also interesting, too, is what the Small Business Coalition is saying here. They said, they have paid the tariffs and they deserve their money back. And this coalition is saying American small businesses, not foreign governments, paid billions of dollars in IEEPA tariffs. They have dipped into their personal savings, taken out high interest loans, laid off employees, and cut wages to cover costs. That is really borne out in the reporting that we've done over the past year. And so the Small Business Coalition, they want every single dollar returned.
And Jolene, I'm not sure this is a question we have an answer to because this ruling just came down today. But for those watching thinking, well, prices went up because of tariffs, what does that mean for me? Do we have an answer to that?
I think it's going to be very gradual. You may see more impact on grocery items like fresh fruits and vegetables, but then when it comes to electronics, apparel, other types of goods that have a longer lead time when it comes to manufacturing, that will be slower. But remember, we're also dealing with decisions from major companies who are also parsing through this decision and trying to figure out what it means for them. And I'm talking about Target, Walmart, Amazon, all of your big box stores. Those companies are going to look very closely at what this means. And remember, back in the pandemic, when we saw so much inflation between 2020 and 2025, companies did not necessarily cut their prices when, say, the supply chain issues were more resolved. So the big question I have here is, what will happen to prices? Will they actually go down, or will companies elect to potentially leave them where they are? We'll have to wait and see, and we'll be watching all of those quarterly earnings reports as those CEOs speak out on this issue.
Oh, yeah, we know you will. Jolene Kent, thank you so much for your time today. And now I want to go to CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson. Okay, Jessica, what does this ruling mean for the use of presidential power?
So it means that presidents don't get to use this particular statute to try and impose the sweeping tariffs that President Trump tried to impose in this case. I think, as always, we have to go back to the Constitution because the federal government only has power if the Constitution gives it that power. Now, in this case, we're looking at the fact that the Constitution gives Congress the power to impose taxes and tariffs and duties. And I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, of course, and that the Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. And the question is whether or not Congress gave that power away in this case. And what the court is saying here is no. IEEPA, it's never been used to impose tariffs before, and it can't be used to impose tariffs in this case. And so I think this really is the Supreme Court looking at the separation of powers. And excuse me if I had any sort of technical issue. So I think this really is the Supreme Court looking at the separation of powers and deciding here that Congress just didn't cede this much authority. And so the president is going to have to look at other statutes to try and impose tariffs.
Can we go back to that ruling? I want you to break it down for us and the justice's opinion on it. Jessica, can you hear me? Okay, it looks like we lost Jessica Levinson. Let's bring in another correspondent, CBS News Congressional correspondent Nicole Killian. Technical issues today, but we're going to get through it. A very, very important news day for us. Nicole, what is the latest reaction from Capitol Hill on the Supreme Court's decision?
Yeah, well, I want to read this statement that we just got in from New York Congressman Greg Meeks, a Democrat, the ranking member on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, because he was actually the one that forced a vote just before Congress recessed in the House to express disapproval to the president's tariffs against Canada. So there was a resolution that he forced a vote on that was ultimately successful with bipartisan support. He notes in his statement today that the Supreme Court's decision confirms what we argued argued in the bipartisan amicus brief that I co-led on behalf of members of Congress. He goes on to say that he will continue to review the Supreme Court ruling to assess future legislative steps, but he does note, as last week's vote on the Canada tariff showed, most Republicans have overwhelmingly chosen to stand by Trump's tariffs at their constituents' expense. So, there was provision, kind of a rule that was tucked into previous legislation that GOP leadership had pushed forth that essentially barred members from bringing any type of legislation to the floor opposing the president's tariffs. And that changed with that vote just last week that Congressman Meeks and other lawmakers forced on the House floor. So it was a significant defeat for House Speaker Mike Johnson, just the fact that they were able to trump that rule, but then secondly, to move forward with this vote expressing disapproval of the president's tariffs against Canada. So there was a big question about its fate in the Senate, whether or not it would move forward. But we have heard by and large from a number of congressional Democrats in particular after this ruling, really expressing relief and believing that this is a win on the part of the argument that many of them have tried to make. Although I would argue, there have been a number of congressional Republicans, not just those who supported this resolution with Congressman Meeks last week, but just overall who have expressed some concern about how the president imposed the tariffs. And so therefore, it was a very fine line many of them had to walk, because some of them certainly acknowledged that they were hearing from their constituents or that they were concerned about the impact that this was having, especially those representing, for instance, a lot of rural districts or rural states. Certainly we know this hit farmers pretty hard, as well as small businesses. That certainly was a point that Elizabeth Warren made in her statement this morning reacting to this ruling, just noting that, yes, it's a victory that we got this ruling, but at the same time, the damage has already been done to some of these small businesses, and it's important to make them right, make them whole, potentially with refunds, which I know you guys have discussed that issue previously in this hour. So again, a lot of relief, certainly on the part of many Democrats who see this as a win. We have heard from a few congressional Republicans, Bernie Moreno, most notably the senator from Ohio, who was quite critical of this ruling, but we will continue to monitor to see what other reaction we get, particularly from congressional Republicans, especially Republican leaders on Capitol Hill. There's Moreno's statement right now calling it an outrageous ruling that handcuffs our fight against unfair trade, as he states there. So far, one of the few reactions we're seeing from Republicans in the wake of this ruling, Mugo.
It's funny you talk about that reaction that we saw there, because what I was going to ask you, and I know you can't read the minds of lawmakers, but is there any indication that this could lead to more of those Congress members, Republican Congress members, speaking out against the president when it comes to the tariff issue?
Well, I'm sure we will continue to see reaction throughout the day specifically to this ruling. But as I stated, there has been quite a robust debate on Capitol Hill, and we have seen lawmakers make many attempts and try to win bipartisan support for various resolutions against the president's tariffs, whether that's tariffs against Canada or Mexico, or more broadly speaking, in terms of, the broader tariffs overall globally. So that is something certainly that we have seen time and again, but usually they're kind of in the form of these symbolic resolutions that don't necessarily have any teeth other than to say we don't agree with what the president is doing here. So certainly that is why I think you're seeing a lot of Democrats in particular come out really celebrating this ruling, because obviously this ruling does have much more teeth than a congressional resolution does, and reaffirms the position that they have been trying to articulate with some of these resolutions, that ultimately this power of tariffs rests with Congress.
Okay, Nicole Killian, thank you so much. We appreciate it. And now let's go back to CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson on the breakdown of the justice's decision in this ruling. Jessica, sorry we lost you there, but I kind of want to get more information from you about how the justices ruled when it came to this tariff issue.
This is such an important question, because I think we tend to believe that when I get on air to talk to you about breaking news and it's a really big case, that the division will be 6-3 along ideological lines. And that's not what we saw today. I think it's important to remember that this really was a question about constitutional powers and interpretation of a statute. And we have a 6-3 decision with all the liberals joining some conservatives. And we see that graphic on the screen shows it better than I could explain. But we have two of the president's appointees, Justice Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, joining with the majority to say he doesn't have the power to do this. And I think it's important to remember that there is a difference between a conservative Supreme Court's view of the president's power over the executive branch, where I think the court believes that the president has a lot of power, versus the court's opinion of any president's power over this area, which is really an area generally left to Congress, an area talking about taxing and regulating commerce. And so I think what we have here, again, is a decision where the justices, yes, huge implications politically, but they're doing something different. They're looking at the Constitution, they're looking at this 1970s era statute, and they're saying, what power does any president get? And that's how you have this breakdown.
And Jessica, I want to ask this because we were speaking with Jan Crawford earlier, and she had said, you know, just from the arguments last year, it almost seemed like there was an indication that the justices would rule this way. But from your experience, I'm sure that's not the case. They could argue and ask lawyers a certain questions, and then when it comes time to rule, they rule a different direction, right?
Well, from my experience, Jan Crawford is always right on this, but absolutely, it is the case that it's difficult to predict based on oral arguments. I will, however, say that I listened to the oral arguments, then I read the transcripts because I knew this moment between us was coming, and I do think that you heard particularly Chief Justice John Roberts, particularly Justice Barrett, really say over and over again a version of, have we ever seen a president use this particular statute for this purpose? Justice Gorsuch also was worried about something that he called the one-way ratchet theory, where he was worried if we give Congress's power to the president now, how can Congress ever claw it back? And that's where I think you ultimately get this breakdown. You're absolutely right that it makes all of us feel very, smart and justified that, yes, I thought they were going to strike down the tariffs. It doesn't always go that way. Sometimes I say I have an omelet, not just egg on my face. This time we were right.
So in their ruling, I believe the justices did not talk about what comes next and how, these small businesses or big businesses, all of them all together, how they're going to get their money back. Is that surprising? Is that something we should have expected to come from them?
No, I think at this point, what we're seeing is that it will go back to the trade court, the International Trade Court. And I apologize if I misheard. There was a little glitch on the audio, but it will go back to the trade court and there'll be a determination really about what the remedy is. So I don't think it's surprising that the court didn't go through and say, and now here's how you implement it. The court basically said, and now we've made our pronouncement about presidential power. Now, the lower courts, again, the specialized court, is going to sort out the specific remedy. It doesn't mean that the court should have. It meant that it just shows us that the court did not. And I mean, I'm going to say what everybody knows and has said. This is going to be a mess in terms of people trying to get back the money that they paid in these tariffs. But whether or not something is a mess, that's not the question for the court. The question for the court is whether or not it's constitutional and legal.
So I suppose the question or the topic of tariffs, that's not over because there are other laws or other ways for the president to impose tariffs, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are other laws. I'm thinking of two in particular that give the president the power to impose tariffs, particularly when there has been a conclusion that there's a national security issue. Now, why didn't the president use those laws when it came to these reciprocal tariffs? And I think because, as I read them briefly, they wouldn't give the president this power, this broad power. And the president wanted to go bigger and bolder. And so this is not a ruling that says presidents never have the power to impose tariffs. This is a ruling that says not under this particular statute. So essentially, if the president wants to try again, he can look to the much more typical statutes where they have been used by presidents to impose tariffs and try and impose what, in my view, would be narrower tariffs. It's not what he wants as a policy matter, but I think it's what he and any president are limited to as a legal matter.
Okay, Jessica Levinson, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. And now I want to go live to CBS News business contributor and business editor at the Dallas Morning News, Javier David. Javier, thank you for your time. Can you walk us through the economic implications of this ruling today?
Yeah, look, February 20th might be the new Liberation Day because markets are already breathing a sigh of relief. We've got the Dow and the NASDAQ up broadly. Jolene was just on. She highlighted governments hated this policy. Companies and small businesses hated this policy. Consumers definitely hated it because it made everything more expensive for them. Yeah. Manufacturing sector and Main Street have been absolutely hammered by these tariffs, and they pushed the manufacturing sector in particular into contraction. So in a number of ways, this is simple math. Tariffs are taxes. Taxes have to be approved by the legislature in order to be enacted. There are alternatives for the White House to sort of pursue. We're not completely out of the woods yet. They could try and use other legal or administrative justifications to resurrect the policy, but there are pretty precise limits on how they can do that. And there certainly won't be as expansive as the Liberation Day tariffs. So he could just go to Congress and ask for new authority. But look, 2025 raised almost $200 billion in revenue. That's according to Yale Budget Data Lab. The effective tariff rate is at nearly 12%. That's the highest it's been in decades. Summing it all up, markets and companies hate uncertainty. This uncertainty was passing costs on to consumers, and they were bearing the brunt of this. But this decision alleviates a lot of that, at least just not right away.
Javier, I have a question for you, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who's noticed this, but typically when prices go up because of one issue or another, when that issue is resolved, they typically don't go down. So what can consumers expect after this ruling today from the Supreme Court?
Look, the good news is, we got another piece of news today, and I just want to back into that. There was another development, and it's also related to tariffs. We got weaker than expected fourth quarter growth. A lot of the focus has been on the shutdown, but actually what was happening is the previous quarters were juiced because a lot of companies were kind of front running the tariffs. So it was artificially inflating the growth numbers just because people were scrambling just to avoid paying these tariffs. So the good news is a lot of that distortion is going to go away because companies are not going to have to pay those anymore. And they're going to certainly be seeking some sort of remuneration for what they have paid. But the bad news is the GDP data also showed consumers are getting tired. The inflationary impact of the tariffs has been real. It's starting to fade. It happens gradually, but the problem with inflation is it's very sticky. We're talking about a lot of supply chains and mechanisms for pricing that get complicated. It's just not as simple as flipping a switch or issuing a court ruling to make them magically go down again. So there is a real open question about what will happen to prices once the tariffs actually go away. It's going to be probably a slow, grudging, gradual normalization in terms of what we're seeing, but what we used to see, but we're not necessarily going to see sort of pre-2024 price levels.
What about those business owners, especially those small business owners? How quickly can we expect that they're going to get their money back? I assume this is going to drag on for quite some time, right?
Yeah, this is going to be as a logistical nightmare, as your previous guest just said. And, there is a real open question about whether the administration will try and fight it or drag their feet, or maybe they will just go to Congress to seek the authority. This really was the president's signature economic policy, and they could try and do a bunch of different things. But this is going to, they're going to have to figure it out. And there's a good estimate here. The Wharton School just put out some numbers, and they said the administration is going to have to, in theory, refund about $175 billion worth of tariff revenue. So that's, again, a real logistical nightmare. Redistributing these proceeds was always going to be a risk, but now it's going to become a reality.
Okay, Javier David, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And for those just joining us, we are talking about breaking news today from the nation's highest court. They have ruled that President Trump does not have the power to impose sweeping tariffs. A lot of questions about what this means for consumers and business owners as well. Let's bring in CBS News political and legal reporter Katrina Kaufman. Katrina, thank you for joining us today. Could you reset for those just joining us? What does this ruling mean?
I mean, the headline of this ruling is that President Trump cannot use the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs. And this has been a core part of his economic agenda. This is a ruling that he said was extremely important. We've learned, CBS has called this ruling a disgrace. He says that he has a backup plan. This is an extremely consequential decision, and on a broader level too, because it has implications about the scope of presidential power and what kind of guardrails the Supreme Court will put up. There have been a lot of questions about that. This is the same Supreme Court that gave presidential immunity to President Trump, but now they are putting up this very strong guardrail in this opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, where he says that the way the president, the administration has interpreted this law, it just does not work with the history, with the statute, with the textual interpretation here.
So moving forward, and I know this is going to take quite some time to figure out, but moving forward, can we expect businesses to use this ruling to file more cases to try and get back some of that money that they've spent on tariffs?
Absolutely. People have already been preparing for this. They have been lawyering up. They have been preparing cases. So I'm sure that we are going to see an onslaught of lawsuits as this gets worked out. It looks as though the appropriate court of this will be the Court of International Trade. So that may be where we see this refund determined, because it was not written into the Supreme Court's opinion here. The only time it was mentioned, in fact, was in Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, where he talks about how the court did not lay out a plan for this over $150 billion in refunds that are likely going to be owed to companies, to consumers. During the arguments and in his dissent as well, he said that they recognize that this is going to be a mess, but it's something that will have to be determined now that this has been knocked down.
Katrina, we know 3 conservative-leaning justices, they ruled against the president. Is there anything that we can glean from that when it comes to this tariff issue?
I mean, it's not completely surprising. During the Supreme Court arguments, these were justices that asked a lot of pointed questions. They expressed real concern about the president taking essentially the power to tax away from Congress. A lot of the discussion was about whether or not a tariff is a tax. What the president, the administration argued was that it was simply a regulatory tool. And also just, as I was just saying, about the scope of presidential power, about the ability of Congress to delegate its core powers to the president, what that would mean for the separation of powers. And these are also justices who are real textualists, who look at the history of words, of the language. And when Chief Justice Roberts broke that down, he just says that the way the administration is interpreting these words, it just doesn't fit with history.
Okay, Katrina Kaufman, thank you for joining us today. Now let's bring in Mark Hamrick, Senior Economic Analyst for Bankrate. Mark, thank you for joining us on CBS News 24/7. I'm sure there are people watching this saying, okay, I kind of understand what they're saying. I kind of don't understand. I just want you to tell me what this means for me. So ultimately, what does this ruling mean for consumers?
Good to be with you. It is very complicated, and we'll be talking about this for quite some time, even as the developments unfold in the future. I would say, first of all, for consumers, this isn't going to change your day-to-day at all in the near future. There is a prospect that it could improve the price environment for goods going out if we get down the road where companies adjust their pricing, if there is this refund dynamic that comes into the equation, which is yet to be determined from a legal standpoint. Let's just sort of try to break it down as to, first of all, what happened. One of the legal tools that the president has used to impose tariffs, which has been essentially the primary headwind for consumers and businesses over the past year, was struck down by the Supreme Court. But the president, as we know, used other legal tools to impose other tariffs. So the estimates I'm seeing is that this affects about 60% of the tariffs that were put in place, but other tariffs remain in place. So we're not being totally absolved or relieved of the tariffs that really, kind of slammed everybody in a shocking way in April of last year, but maybe the majority. Then there's the question of, will the president, will the administration try to use these other tools to basically replace the one that was struck down? So, consumers are eager to be relieved of their primary irritation or adjutant these days, and that is inflation and elevated prices. But firms are not going to be rushing to cut prices anytime soon because they've already paid for this inventory. But if it is sustained essentially as this policy and this practice cannot stand, then that will remove one of the primary triggers for inflation affecting goods, which has really affected the economy, it's affected the Federal Reserve, it's affected consumer sentiment and spending. And so we would welcome this win for consumers and businesses if it holds.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, is this just a let's wait and see what comes next when it comes to impact?
Well, you might celebrate the decision, but it doesn't provide any clarity with respect to what the prices are that you're going to be paying as a consumer in the near term. If there are the refunds given to the firms that paid the tariffs, and that's another question yet to be ironed out, that's not going to go to consumers. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked if the administration, comes forward at some point in the coming days or weeks or months, which has been discussed, for weeks and months now, about some sort of rebate. But now when we're having something like $175 billion in tariffs revenues in question, if not going away, then that becomes another way of inflaming debt and deficit. So, there's a lot up in the air here. I would say just, follow the news. We'll be interpreting it going forward, but it doesn't change anything about what you're going to experience as a consumer in the very near term. It could in the intermediate term or the long term.
Okay. Mark Hamrick, thank you so much for your insight today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have much more on CBS News 24/7. We've been talking about that breaking news from the Supreme Court today. They have ruled that President Trump does not have the power to impose sweeping tariffs. Much more when we come back. I'm Mugo Odigwe. You're streaming CBS News 24/7.
Go to the ends of the earth. We'll hit the heights.
A great adventure together.
And reach for the stars.
Star power. I like it.
So cool.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking.
Something that's undeniable.
With mindfulness. Innovative.
Magical.
It's like being a child.
And truly original reporting.
God, you do your research.
I tell a good story. Because there's always something new.